So we'll introduce each of the speakers, and Antonia will speak first of all and introduce her topic today, which is chewing the cud, looking a little bit deeper at the topic of agriculture, and then we'll move slightly into thinking about agriculture as one of the land use choices we have, and think about land use and land cover change with Dr. Mike Rivington. At the end, we'll leave time for questions, so they're feedback through to me. What I'll try to do is repeat them, because not only the audience in the room today, you're struggling to hear me, but I can tell you if you're online or listening to this recording in the future, you won't be able to hear those people who are projecting forwards. So I'll try to repeat those and make sure they go back, just to help those who aren't here in person today. So this is a joint programme. I've got to thank Kate Traherne for putting it together, but XR Dundee, together with the University of Dundee Botanic Gardens and Numwell Community Garden.
Do you have a microphone you can speak into?
There is a microphone here.
Can you talk into it?
Yeah, I am talking into it. But in terms of, was that one better?
Okay, but we're going to just check on the
might
sound
be
so we
turning up,
can put it up.
Yeah. Okay. I'll keep trying. Today's speakers are subject experts looking to share insights into one of the world's biggest challenges and one of humans, you could say, civilization's greatest achievements. We haven't had to think until very recently about where our food has come from, but agriculture is a very, very complex subject, and farming in particular results in complex problems. And it's a systems thinking way that we need to understand them. If you think, only 4 crops, wheat, maize, rice and soybean, feed 2/3 of the world's population today. In reality, it's symptomatic of a dominant social system that's out of balance with the environment, the earth system, upon which it depends. The governance of our food system is complex and it's global. The impact on land use choices and through land cover change on water, soil and air quality are felt by humans, and the impact of biodiversity locally and globally. But this story is one we don't have to be passive standbys to. Globally, 70% of agriculture is actually urban and peri-urban. We think, from the Western perspective, about industrial agriculture that's feeding our hungry cities, where 85% of us live, and yet most of the agriculture in the land around our cities goes someplace else as part of a commodity supply chain. We'll explore that today. Through both of our speakers, who I will now introduce. So the first speaker that I'm going to bring up is Dr. Antonia Eastwood. She's the Senior Conservation Scientist at the RSPB. She was formerly working at James Hutton Institute, where she is a social ecologist with experience working in a wide range of countries, including the UK and the UK overseas territories and the Balkans. Originally a conservation biologist who became interested in the need for more integrated solutions to conservation biology, specifically the dynamics of human ecosystems, through application of interdisciplinary research to biodiversity conservation and the governance of ecosystem services. Antonia, can I invite you up to address the group today?
Okay? Is that okay? Can you hear me okay? No. Okay, I'll try and speak louder. Yeah? Okay? Better. Okay, I've got to remember, have it like an ice cream cone, yeah? Okay, great. So, apocalypse now. So there's a biodiversity crisis, there's a climate crisis. What does that make you want to do? Well, it's your instinct. It means, you fight, you flight. So why am I asking you to slow down and have deeper, broader conversations with people? Well, good question. I mean, I've been working in biodiversity conservation for 30 years, and I'm just as frustrated as you about the lack of change, the lack of anything making a difference. But I've worked in sort of complex systems for quite a long time, trying to understand the social dimensions of complex systems. And I've only just recently started at the RSPB, and food and farming is quite a new topic for me. But what I do know is that systems and complex sort of systems don't have easy solutions. There isn't a simple answer to solving complex systems. And what I've noticed quite recently, there's been a lot of polarization of arguments and kind of people going into them and us camps. And I'm a little bit worried about that, because with complex systems we need to try and understand the system, and we need to make compromises. So what I wanted to try and do is just to make a start by looking at some of the complexity around livestock farming and some of the complex questions and problems and issues, and to try and see that it's actually not so simple as you think, and trying to think of ways of how we can make better decisions and better sort of support systems that these support the complex systems that we're talking about. So here, talking about farming, particularly livestock farming, as I've said, there's been a lot of press, a lot of bad press. Farmers have been getting a lot of bad press recently. Here we've got examples from the Netherlands, and also we've got an article here by George Monbiot. And what concerns me a little bit is that there's a lot of reductive, simplistic language. And I think people are being blamed for one type of agriculture or not another type of agriculture. And to be honest, I don't think this is going to be at all helpful in developing more sustainable ways of farming, more sustainable ways of working, or looking after the planet. So let's have a look at livestock farming in particular. Is livestock farming as bad as we think? It's been portrayed really bad for the planet, and I'm kind of left thinking, well, let me think about my experience. So, George Monbiot was complaining, he was saying that livestock farming, extensive livestock farming, pasture-fed livestock farming is bad for the planet. And I sort of recall, so this is me 20 years ago in a national park in Croatia, and this is what we call high nature value grasslands. These are incredibly diverse grasslands, which predominantly now occur in sort of Southeast Asia and the Alps. We also do have them in Scotland as well, high nature value grasslands. It basically means there's a lot of biodiversity still there. And here I am with an expert, grassland biodiversity expert, and his name is Jerry Tallowan. And what I do remember about Jerry, he was so enthusiastic about cattle. And he said, he said he was so enthusiastic, he called them biodiversity engineers. And the reason why is because they are non-selective grazers. They graze the pasture to create structural diversity in a grassland. And that structural diversity, what does that bring? It brings insect diversity. And insect diversity, as we know, with food chains, brings bird diversity. Another thing that he kind of was really excited about is seeing dung pads. Dung pads, okay. What he talked about is basically that they're like little germination pods. They're germination pods. They create bare soil for seeds to germinate. They also have their own little specialist ecosystems like dung beetles and things like that. So it made me think, okay, so this is an extensive livestock system. These are sort of subsistence farmers with just a few cattle and a few sheep. So he spoke about how wonderful the biodiversity was. But he also did discuss about, well, what happens if you have too much cattle, too much stock? That's where we get soil erosion, poaching, ingression of weeds, and obviously then we've got soil exposure, runoff, and also a loss of biodiversity. He also spoke about the use of artificial fertilizers and how artificial fertilizers they basically release nitrates into the soil, which means that actually there's more grasses that appear in the sward than wildflowers. And this way, just by adding artificial fertilizer and making nitrates available to the grass species, you get a loss of biodiversity. So obviously this was getting me thinking about, okay, this is not as easy as it is, you know. But then I thought about, well, but that's not really the agricultural system that's been operating the most of UK, large parts of the UK and in northwestern Europe. We've got actually quite intensive farming. And because of this intensive farming, where basically since the Second World War, there was a push to produce more food, to produce greater yields, for more productivity. And the resulting things were that we increased our use of artificial fertilizer, we increased the use of pesticides, of herbicides. And then not only that, so we've got a push for food production after the Second World War, then we have a system, an economic system that is driving productivity and pushing for more productivity and yields. But what at? At the expense of the environment, biodiversity, polluting rivers, polluting our water. So we've got a situation where we've got huge losses of biodiversity. So just as an example, in Scotland, I'll take an example in Scotland. So we've got sort of curlew populations. So curlew populations, if I remember my guidebooks, I'm not a bird specialist, it looks like a big chicken, but with a curly beak. Yeah. So the curlew populations is a farmland bird. Its populations have declined by 60%. Over the past 20 years. So you can see the catastrophic disaster that has happened to our biodiversity, and it's the intensive farming systems. So why is livestock getting such a bad press of all the other agricultural systems? Well, I think one of the reasons is because cattle and sheep are ruminants. So they produce, through their ruminant digestive system, they produce methane gas. And so methane is more, and Mike can probably correct me later, is more, it's a stronger greenhouse gas than, say, carbon dioxide. So they produce methane. However, we mustn't forget that there's also the direct emissions from agriculture, which I think possibly maybe Mike was talking about. It's about the processing, it's about the feeding of livestock with cereals that have been fed cereals which have been artificially fertilized. And it's the whole process, the whole transport system that we need to look at in terms of livestock emissions. Because actually the direct emissions from cattle is relatively small in comparison to everything else that we're doing. And these are just some figures there. So again, we have to look at the whole system and not just one thing or another. And I think what I'm trying to get is the systems are complex, and it takes a lot of understanding and knowledge to kind of tease the things apart and put it under the whole global system. So let's go back to the fact that actually livestock also can produce really nature-rich, diverse grasslands. So another thing about Scotland and, say, farming in Scotland. A lot of this is a land capability map. You can see that the stuff in pink, basically this is where you can't grow crops. So it's kind of low fertile areas, and this is where traditionally livestock grazing and livestock farming would have occurred. And this is the same throughout Europe, in the kind of less fertile areas. Livestock grazing is because you cannot grow crops there. So if Scotland is to become more sustainable, we still do need to rely on some livestock grazing. So, as you've seen, it's a complex situation. There's lots of things to think about: biodiversity, climate change, food systems, where we get our food from. But what I want us to try and think about is that actually farmers weren't the ones that created the economic system that they are having to work under. And I think if we are to work towards a transformation, a transition into more sustainable ways of farming and food production, we need to actually support farmers. We need to work with them as communities, as policymakers, as consumers, try and support the farmers in the transition that they're having to make. We've already lost a huge amount of small-scale farmers because of our food sort of global system of pushing for production of food. So let's work with them. So this is an example from about a year ago when I spoke about polarisation, that we mustn't polarise ourselves into them and us camps, and we need to work together. Because this is a project, and RSPB is a partner on the project, but you can see that by not talking to people that work the land, that farm the land, you get polarisation, you get animosity, you get conflict. This is not going to help us move forward. We are learning as an organisation, RSPB are learning as an organisation to work with people, to collaborate, to try and reach out and compromise. So we've talked about complex systems and complex sort of ecosystems, working with people. The other thing is that, which adds more complexity to the situation, is that people, when you're working with people, they often have very different values. They have beliefs, different attitudes. And they might think that they have different solutions to offer. And what we need to do is actually reach out and work with people with different values and beliefs. And how do we do that, and why is it important? So, the question is, why should I have conversations with people that I don't agree with, or I have a different opinion to, or I don't agree with them? Well, the reason is, well, there are several reasons. One of the reasons is that by having these conversations, we begin to understand their situation and their difficulties that they're having to also survive in the system that they haven't created. So that's one reason. So we've also got a moral reason about inclusivity in including different voices in kind of moving and deciding the solutions forward. The other very important thing is that when we interact with other people, they bring different knowledges and different understandings about how the system is. As I've said, the system is complex. We need to understand a lot about the soils, about the animals, about the livestock, lots of things, climate change, soil science, all this. It's complicated. We need to bring together a lot of knowledges, and this is why we need to hear and learn from other people. One of the ways, the best ways to do that is through deliberation. And deliberation is a way of having discussions where groups of people come together and they discuss issues, they reflect on what other people are saying, they debate and have meaningful discussions. And this has been shown to actually lead to more decisions that are based on the social good rather than individual values. So working with and listening to other people is very, very important. So, but how do you listen to other people? How do you get their trust? Well, this is the reason why we need to reach out and we need to build trust and build relationships, because one of the things about learning is that you learn more from your peers, you learn more from people that you understand and you trust. So this is why we need to reach out, particularly I think after these sort of silos we've been in because of the COVID. We've been very sort of living in our own bubbles and kind of thinking about our own things. And I think now is the time to reach out and to try and support people. There's a lot of work and a lot of things that need to change, and I think the farmers in particular need their support. And here is just a quote from a scientist at RSPB who manages the RSPB site in Cumbria, in Holswater, the Lake District. And he's also realising the same thing. It's uncomfortable to talk to people whose views that you have different views, but in order to make sure that we understand what's going on, to gain understanding and try and work, sort of make solutions that are sustainable on the ground, that's what we need to do. So there is a lot of things going on. There's a lot of things working in sustainable farming systems. There are applied researchers, farmers, discovering new things. There's been a wealth of information. So you can see a lot of people are trying different things. There's regenerative agriculture, there's agroforestry. There's a lot of knowledge out there and that can be shared as well. So I think, I suppose my main message is to try and engage with the system, engage and support farmers and engage in your consumer choices in supporting them as they make through this transition. And I just wanted to end on a positive note because we saw some amazing grasslands from Croatia at the beginning. This is a walk farm in Aberdeenshire. A lot of the biodiversity that you see was created by the farmer, it's Laurel, and she's got a livestock farm and she's created these amazing wildflower meadows. You can see the red campion. You can see the flocks of birds that are feeding on the stubble that she's left, and because she hasn't used pesticides or herbicides, there's lots of seeds for the birds to eat. So I think we need to celebrate the farmers that are doing great stuff and help them share the knowledge that they've learnt. And also she's got an amazing business, not only selling her organic meats, but also producing some fantastic pies. So So I just want to say thank you, and any questions? Hopefully that might spur a little bit of sort of thought. Thank you.
Is this one on? Can you hear? Yes. Thank you, Antonia. What we're going to do is put the questions to the end, because what I'm going to do is introduce Mike and then ask Mike to come up and speak with us. In terms of that story, just bear in mind this concept that complex things can't be solved with simple solutions. And when we solve them, we don't always solve them in a just way. So there are winners and losers. So trying to find a way through a problem with 10 billion people on the planet by 2100, with all of the resources that are required to support them, because agriculture is not just about food. It's also fuel, it's pharmaceuticals, it's fibre, and it's also the timbers increasingly that we use to construct the environments that we live in. In terms of my segue to Mike, I just want to introduce him in terms of his role, the science, but also that continuity from systems thinking down to land use and land cover change. Mike is a senior scientist at James Land Institute, where he is a land use systems modeller. He's got a background in both ecology and natural resource management, but his main interests now are in understanding how climate change impacts land use and ecosystems in Scotland and also globally, and how to mitigate and adapt options, and how mitigation and adaptation options can be developed. An interesting segue I saw at the end of his profile was this. He's also the principal investigator on a UK-funded project to look at the UK food and nutrition security during and after COVID-19 pandemic, which must be quite a frightening role to lead. So I welcome you up onto the floor here today, Mike, and in doing so, I hope your talk's ready, and you check the mic and it works for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm just going to do a wee bit of rearranging, so could I get a thumbs up, thumbs down sound? Excellent, thank you. So thanks very much, Kevin. So today I'm going to talk about transforming the food system, but it's very much in the context of, as Kevin has said, sort of land use and land use change, land cover, and what I really liked about Antonia's presentation is a really nice sort of lead in, the sort of how you can focus in at what was like a farm level, field level, down to individual sort of habitats, I take much of a bigger sort of global sort of perspective on these things. So what I would ask as I go through the presentation is just to think of that sort of continuum between what might be happening at a particular little bit of field with some grazing, encouraging biodiversity, but also what's happening on the global scale and the scale of the drivers that affect the direction that we're going in. So I will start off with this slide in these sort of presentations because sometimes we forget just how amazingly beautiful this place is. And all of our food, everything comes from here. You know, all the food that we have from all around the world, amazing mixes of spices and nutritional value and things. But we live in a very privileged society. And I think that we have to be careful not to get distorted in looking at the food system from our perspective, because we can go 2 minutes down the road and go into a supermarket and have a huge array. But there are still 850 million people who are seriously malnourished, and about 2/3 of the world's population are in some form of malnutrition or go hungry. So broaden our minds in terms of how we think about the food system. Unfortunately, I can't see the slides now, so I don't have to try and remember what I was saying. Yeah, we're brewing out the perfect storm. Antonia has mentioned we have a climate crisis, we have a biodiversity crisis, we have massive ecosystem degradation as well. So what we're finding is that there's an increasing probability of multiple shocks. Now, the first thing, one of the first things that I did when the lunatic Putin invaded Ukraine was to go and have a look at a website in the States to tell me what's happening with the El Nino-La Nina cycle. Because quite a few years ago I was involved in a project looking at the risks of extreme weather and the resilience to the global food system. And one of the things we recognised in that was that the increasing probability of multiple shocks. So I thought if there's going to be a war in Ukraine, big exporter of grain, and Russia, big exporter of fertiliser, and there's a big climate shock coming, we're going to be in an even bigger situation. So I'm monitoring quite carefully what's happening with the El Nino-La Nina cycle next year. It looks like we're going to quite a rare third La Nina cycle, and see what that does to our weather in the future. And I always sort of think about the fact that the global food system accounts for about 1/3 of all emissions. Now that can come from the agriculture, but it's also in terms of the transport and the energy used in the production systems. And increasingly what we're finding is that it's actually agriculture isn't the biggest part of that contribution to that 1/3. It's the upstream processing and the downstream processing within the food system that leads to the total amount of emissions. And as with all things, I'm a firm believer that prevention is better than cure. The climate crisis, it can be avoided. The biodiversity crisis, it can be avoided. And I never separate the biodiversity and the climate crisis. They are two parts of the same thing. Currently we have an economic and market system that doesn't properly cost the impacts of the food system. And that's best highlighted in terms of the human cost from overnutrition, that is large amounts of obesity. Obesity costs the NHS about £5.5 billion per year, but that's not factored into the food system. The government has resisted imposing fat, salt and sugar taxes, for example. They're not following the Henry D. Nibbleby's National Food Strategy, or National Food Plan very well. And environmental cost of production isn't incorporated into the cost of food. So then we have a dilemma. How do you actually cover the true cost of food production, but without marginalising even more people? We have a grossly inequitable food system, and a lot of people who can't afford good, nutritious food. So how do you increase the price of food and make sure that money goes to the right places, but without making people even more food impoverished? And the reason why I put this map up is just to sort of illustrate the land use, land cover aspects for the UK. I don't know if, excuse me. I don't know if you can see the very top, Shetland. It's not to show that all the fruit and vegetables are grown in Shetland, of course they're not, it's just an area representation issue. But in the UK, we have almost as much land for golf courses than we do for fruit and vegetable production. And yet we import about 80% of our fruit and vegetables. And as you can see by the large amounts of green, so much of the land use is centred around the livestock systems. Now, as Antonia has quite rightly pointed out, that can have benefits if it's managed correctly and with the right sort of motivations. But it's also a question of scale. Now, if we follow the Committee on Climate Change recommendations by reducing our red meat consumption by about 25%, try and picture how that map could reshape itself. Think of those, you remember those sort of games you played, moving the tiles across to try and get one square from one corner down to the other one. So think how you might sort of change that sort of layout so that you actually had something which is a sustainable system that produces good value, nutritious food, acceptable for everybody, and importantly enables viable rural communities to continue. That is, enables farming to continue profitably. Sometimes the word, the idea of farmers being profitable seems a bit unsavoury, but it's business and they have to keep going year in, year out. It's how they achieve profitability that is the most important thing. Now, I'm sure you've probably seen things similar to this before. I'm going to show a brief animation about CO2 emissions globally. I'll try and explain a little bit how this works. You may see the red dot at the bottom of the left-hand graph. That's from a place called Manoa in Hawaii. It's the centre for where purest air is measured to monitor carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And the one on the far, the dot on the far right, that represents a place near the South Pole, and the one on the right-hand side of the left-hand graph, that's somewhere near the North Pole. So you've got a complete global spectrum. And I'm going to run it through time. And as you noticed, not surprisingly, atmospheric concentration is going up. But also notice how it's bouncing. What that is primarily the northern hemisphere sequestering lots of carbon during the growth of the summer and then sort of losing it as well. Notice how the southern hemisphere is quite stable. That's mainly because there's less land. But remember that figure that I said is 34% of all emissions come from the food system. So all of this movement we're seeing, about 1/3 of it, is because of the food system. So it indicates just how important land use and land management could be for reducing this part as well. The graph on the right-hand side, that's the thing called the Keeling curve. I'm sure probably you've come across this before. It's the famous graph of the increase of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. And as you can see, it's on a permanent trajectory upwards, hopefully not permanent. Now, if we're trying to reverse this, if we want to bring that atmospheric concentration back down again, we have to really seriously think about what the opportunities are for using the benefits of land use and land use change and transformation in the food system to sequester as much carbon as possible, but also to reduce emissions from the system as much as possible. Now, we have to accept that if we want to eat, there are going to be emissions. It's unavoidable. But it's just a question of bringing it down to an acceptable minimum. And also then how other sectors beyond agriculture are able to change. I think too much of the emphasis is placed on agriculture to reduce emissions because it's seen as an easy win, whereas a lot of other sectors are perhaps a little bit more embedded in the whole system and can resist more easily. Just the last part of the graph is just extending back to several 100,000 years, just to sort of illustrate just where we are at the moment. I think it's also very important to try and put climate change impacts into context. I think in Scotland we're quite insulated against the emerging climate and biodiversity threats. We have the benefit of living in a maritime climate. We're surrounded by the sea, We're a fair distance from the main body of the European continent. Our climate here in Scotland is quite stable, but we have to again think about what's happening around the rest of the world. This graphic here in the centre is one that we produced for COP27 last year in Glasgow, and basically it took the climate record from Glasgow, where the exhibition centre is, and then projected forward with 12 different climate projections. And what you can see is the gradual trend over time of increasing warming. Now, you can take 12 different climate projections and say, well, any one of those are possible. Some of them are less likely than others, but to the right-hand side, there are a couple of the things on the global scale that would change if we reach those sort of levels. And the two that are highlighted by the red boxes. The first one, 2060, collapse of the Amazon rainforest. Now, the Amazon rainforest only has to decrease in size by about a further 7% to get to what scientists have referred to as a critical point of about 25%, and the Amazon rainforest stops functioning in the same way as it does now and could flip to a savanna system. The next one up I find particularly scary. It's just that by about the 2070s, we could be in a situation where only 38% of all the emissions emitted are sequestered by nature. Now, we're constantly looking to nature-based solutions to help us with the fight against climate change, but at the same time we're destroying the environment that is trying to work for us and sequestering carbon, then it's making our battle even harder. One of the interesting things about transforming the food system is that a lot of the emphasis seems to be on human health, as in physical health, better nutrition, but I think there's another aspect to that as well, which is mental health, mental well-being. We all want to try and do something to try and alleviate the climate crisis, and one of the best mediums we can do that through is how we consume food, or what we purchase. So I think there's a great opportunity for, at a national level, for a common direction of action, so that we can all be taking some positive steps for climate change mitigation. Don't worry about the graphic on this. This is going back to this project I was working on about 8 years ago about resilience of the global food system to extreme weather. The important output from that was the scale of the shock depends on the current state of the system at the time. So fairly recently we had a situation where we've got an emerging climate crisis, and then the war in Ukraine, and then a ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal. And it doesn't take very much for us to reach those critical points when the system could stop functioning. So we have to be really careful to avoid any sort of situations where we get coinciding events that can let a whole situation spin out of control. There was a recent global assessment report by the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and they produced a whole range of different assessments of the state of the climate. So this point is really about, it's not just a climate crisis, it's an ecological and it's a biodiversity crisis as well. Hopefully you can read this, because unfortunately I can't, because I've got my glasses on. I don't need to read that. So, but I'll just pick up on the one point I've highlighted in red. Is that even for a global warming of 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees, the majority of terrestrial species ranges are projected to shrink profoundly. Apologies for not being able to read my own text. But the point I'm trying to make about this one is that even under relatively small amounts of further warming, ecological functions are likely to fundamentally change, and this is where we start getting into the realms of tipping points. And where the food system starts to connect to a lot of the things we do as a global society, I'm trying to highlight here in this graph. So on the left-hand side, you have a lot of the human activities. That includes increasing numbers of livestock, and increasing use of fertilizers, and what the climate impacts are on the right-hand side. So you can see the general trajectories for the negative things are going up, and all the other aspects from the climate side are changing as well. And one of the things that I'm particularly keeping an eye on is what's happening in the Arctic in terms of the Arctic sea ice extent. I think that's obviously the canary in the coal mine. So I think the fact that we could actually be in an ice-free state within the next 20 to 30 years will fundamentally change the way our climatic systems function. So going back to the IPBS report again for the details about just what the current state of our ecosystems are in. So going back to that point about it depends on the state of the system at the point of a shock. If we have a seriously degraded global ecosystem, and then we have other forms of shock, be it conflict, or trade, or financial system collapse, then we're in an even weaker situation, which is why I keep going back to this thing of prevention is better than cure. I'm just going to try and illustrate this point even further, that we have a strange situation where we have increasing emissions, despite awareness of the problems for the last 6 decades, possibly longer really, and yet we also have increasing or decreasing capacity of our ecosystems to absorb the emissions that we put up, and it's a balance, and we're losing balance. And where that comes into in respect of the food system is the more out of balance it goes, the less likely we are to be able to produce enough food for an increasing global population. Just very recently we've hit 8 billion. And as Kevin said, by 2050 we could be at 10, who knows. But if we're going to be able to do that, our ecosystems have to be in a safe, stable and healthy, fully functioning form to be able to do that. And without that, we won't have food security. I'm going to try and sort of bring it down to a more local level now. This is an animation I'm going to show you about a plant heat stress indicator, and it's basically just the count of the number of days above 25 degrees in a year, and it runs from 1960 right up to 2080. So from 1960 up to 2019, it's observed weather data, and then from then on it's climate projection data. And the point I'm going to illustrate with this is just the spatial difference across the country, even a country relatively small like the UK, in terms of climate impacts. So we do this to try and visualise what climate change impacts might actually look like. So it started from 1960, it's an annual count, just the count of the number of days above 25 degrees. And what you see is that actually it's relatively stable. Some of the older generation might recognise 1976. I was in a car with my mum driving from London to Plymouth, and we broke down 7 times because the car kept overheating. 1976 was considered a hot year. It was just going to hit 2003, European heat wave, large amounts of mortality in Europe. But still, you see, there's inter-annual variability, but it's fairly stable. And now we're into climate projection territory. Now, this is for the current high emissions scenario, but it's made up of 12 different projections. It's the average of the 12 different projections. So some of the projections are quite warm, up to about 3.5 degrees, and others are quite modest, about 1.5 degrees. So this is just a medium. But what you can start to see is a very large increase in the number of warm days. And whenever I see this, I see a lot of very thirsty and very hot people down in the southeast of the UK. And I've shown this to UK government in various meetings, and one of the interesting comments in the chat, because I was doing it online, was, what's this going to do to our house prices? So another form of visualisation we work with is what happens to the soil-water balance. Soil water is one of the fundamentals for us to be able to do agriculture. And what you see at the top graph is output from a soil-water balance model, run using 30 years of observed weather data for a brown earth soil near bigger, and the one below is a future projection. Now it is quite a warming projection. It's one of the more extreme ends, about 3.5 degrees and about 14%, 14% drier. But the take-home messages from this is just there's going to be less water available for agriculture. So on the bottom of the graph, there's a lot more white space. That's the missing water. The other thing to note is that in the historical period, there were about 3 years in the 30 where plants may get a bit stressed and sort of production may be a bit lower. The bottom graph, it's 24 years out of the 30. So think of that as an ecosystem. It's not going to have the chance to recover because it's not got periods of wetting. What's that going to do to the soil microbes? What's it going to do to the fungi in the soil and the rest of the vegetation that's sitting on top of it? Another area of my work is involved in running a crop simulation model, trying to understand the impacts of climate change on yield and other aspects of crop growth. So what you're seeing here are maps of where in Scotland yield may either increase or decrease. And so red is areas where it decreases and blue is where it could increase. So we have a very diverse range of soils within Scotland and very spatially distributed as well. And what a lot of this variation in terms of the yield responses comes from is in the ability of the soils to retain water. So soils that are able to retain water better give a much better buffering capacity to those years when there's less water available. So when you start looking at this sort of maps, you then think, well, who's going to win from this? Who's going to lose? How can you support farmers to be able to cope with these sorts of situations? But on top of that is how do you then start thinking about that change in the mosaic of the land uses that I was talking about at the beginning, and also considering aspects like the 30 by 30 goal for getting 30% of the UK's land area under protection, but also the ambitions for tree planting. Where are they going to go? In respect to the food system, there's a huge mismatch as well between what we produce and what we eat, and that's the figure at the sort of top right. We produce far too much cereals and not enough fruit and vegetables, far too much sugar. On a global context, actually, the livestock numbers, the amount of meat is right. I think we also have to be really careful about laying into livestock farming per se, because in a lot of the parts of the world, that's the only form of protein they're going to get. So, on a global scale, maybe it's not a question of shifting the total numbers of animals, it's just where they're produced and who they're produced for. So in our sort of diet, we have overconsumption. In other places, they have underconsumption. So if we want to try and reverse child malnutrition, maybe we should be supporting livestock farming, but in the right place, in the right context. As I said before, there's also a very heavy reliance on imports of key things like fruit and vegetables. So think about where they're coming from. Now, a lot of those places where our fruit and vegetables are coming from are likely to experience severe water shortages and are running off of aquifers that are being depleted and not restored. So this is a problem we will have to face at some point, of how do we change that mosaic of land uses within the UK to give us not necessarily self-reliance, self-sufficiency, but a better level of balance in terms of the benefits we get from international trade. You can think of what international trade in food is a good wealth redistribution issue, but also something where we have a certain element of resilience to any of the shocks that may emerge. As I say, we don't really properly cost the damage that the food system does to people or the environment, and that's best illustrated by the number of people who are overweight or obese. And a lot of that comes down to the lack of choice that we have for a lot of people about where the food comes from. Now, I do apologise, there's a lot of text on here, and there's actually no chance of me being able to read it from here. But as Kevin said, I was leading a UK-wide project looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on UK food security, but it was with the perspective of what could we learn in terms of the other types of threats, for example biodiversity and the climate crisis. And I guess the main point I want to make about this is that COVID was a demand-side shock, not a production shock. It was an economic access problem, not a lack of food available around the world. The difference then between COVID and the climate biodiversity crisis is the climate biodiversity crisis will cause a production side shock. That is, potentially less food available, which will then self-perpetuate into demand side shock in that the prices will go up and large sections of the society won't be able to afford food. So what are the lessons that we could learn from COVID? Well, as I said already, the food system doesn't account for the true cost. So there's an opportunity to challenge food system governance. I always argue we need to follow the money. Where does the money go from? When we buy food, where does it go? It doesn't really go to the producers in anywhere near enough. It gets lost in the supply chain. And there's a lot of organisations, a lot of companies making a lot of money. Now, making money isn't a bad thing, but it's, again, this idea of rebalancing so that it's fair and it's equitable, and the investments in maintenance of ecosystem services and making sure farmers are paid a decent price for what they produce and how they produce it. So yeah, big questions to ask about the governance of the food system. I think around the world there's only about 110 key buyers that determine how the food system works, and as Kevin pointed out, we rely on 4 key crops. Yeah, there are huge opportunities for diversification. So I'm just going to, this is my final slide, just some thoughts on how we might resolve the situation. For me, a lot of it always comes down to risk perception. If we understand the risks and the scale of the risks, the probability of them happening and when they're going to happen, we change our behaviour. And the analogy that I use is, you don't cross the road if you can see the bus coming. And the problem at the moment is, I think globally as a society, we still can't see the bus coming. So collectively as a society, we're about to step in front of the bus. Now, what worries me about that part is that people like myself and others have been talking about this for decades, and we still can't see the bus coming. And sometimes it doesn't matter how much you shout that the bus is coming really fast and it's really big. So how do you change it? I always think that the benefit is positive solutions. There are so many really, really good things that can be done to change the way the food system works, and in fact the whole economic model that we work with can change if it's focused on human well-being and maintenance of ecosystem services, that is healthy ecosystems, then we've got a fighting chance. So we need to rebalance our use of land. So it's a better combination of agricultural production and nature conservation. In terms of reducing the externalities of the costs, we have to find, for me, the key is how do you charge the right price for an item of food so that the producer gets a fair wage from it, the people who produce it get a fair wage, and it covers the cost, the damage that product does. Now, that means that some things should really could stop heavy use of fertilisers, shifting to agroecological processes, so you rely less on imports, inputs. But that means that the farmer needs to receive some sort of additional support, for example, the potential reduction in the levels of yields. So we might have to pay for our food more. But what about the people at the bottom who can't afford that? Well, I think if they're paid a decent wage in the first place, then hopefully that will resolve the economic access issue to food. Given the point of this presentation was talk about land use change, I think there has to be a lot of integration and forward planning about how you actually do that sort of integration. It shouldn't be led by the market. It has to be science informed and followed by the market. Currently what we're seeing is a bit of a land grab in the UK. for companies wanting to offset, they're able to buy marginal land at a cheaper price and plant trees. That might sound good, but chances are the land that they're planting it on isn't appropriate for trees because it's high in carbon. There's a probability that the best places to plant trees, if you want to get carbon sequestration in trees, is plant it on some of the best agricultural land because there's very little carbon in the soil in the first place, and it's also got quite favourable growing conditions. So this sort of transformation in land and land use has to be informed by science and worked with in terms of the policy development. The Scottish Government are currently looking at replacements for common agricultural policy, and some of the steps look really quite positive and exciting, if a little bit complicated. But if they work, it could be really, really good, and it could be quite a substantial sort of step change in how subsidies or support is provided to farmers to achieve the balance that I've been talking about. And finally, the food system needs to be based on resilience, not efficiency. We've been sort of talking about shifting to a just-in-case rather than a just-in-time type approach. We have a very low storage capacity in the UK. We don't have much functional redundancy in the food system in the UK. And we're only literally a couple of weeks away from serious food shortages. And I find that sort of quite frightening, given the sort of probabilities of increased coinciding climate and ecosystem shock events. And I will close on just a really positive note. Going back to the bus analogy, we recognise that the bus is coming, but we do have plenty of really, really good solutions, and there are already a lot of really, really good things happening out there. They just need to be happening at greater scale. Thank you.